This lecture is part one of the stratification lecture related to the core concepts in your Conley textbook. And here is the outline for this lecture. I'm going to review the two concepts, social institutions and organizations, that we discussed earlier in the semester and are foundational to discussing the remaining weeks of our semester that revolve around this core concept of stratification, which of course I will review, and then I will briefly highlight the various types of stratification that are also covered in your textbook. So as a review, here are four of the most defining characteristics of social institutions. And so the image you see on the right side of the screen represents the most dominant social institutions that sociologists have identified and studied. Right, so social institutions, we want to understand them as not just a physical building, again, that they involve many things beyond the physical, right, in terms of like the building and the infrastructure. So we're going to stick with our example that we used earlier in the semester of higher education, right? And higher education is actually just a piece of the institution of education, right? Because there's K through 12, there's pre-K, right? And then when you go beyond the bachelor's level, right? So it's pretty expansive in terms of who this institution serves. But what we do know is that each of the institutions, as we see here on the screen, represent a group of social positions that perform a function, right? This doesn't mean that there's not overlap, but there are many things that the institution of education does that religion does not, for instance. Each of the institutions that we are going to be focusing on for the rest of the semester also represent important traditions in society, right? They are influential of its members, and they are socially recognized, highly valued, and protected. So an example of what it means to say that an institution is socially recognized or widely recognized is that you don't even have to have any kind of direct or explicit connections to an institution, but you can still know what it does. So an example for me would be the military. So I am not in the military and I have never been enlisted in the military, but I understand very well not just that it exists, but what are the traditions that it represents. I know quite a bit about the various positions of different branches of the military. I understand that it's highly valued and protected, right? Even though I have never personally been enlisted or have any immediate family members presently that are affiliated with any of the branches of the military, right? And so the military is an example of part of the institution of the government, right? So this is what it means to say that these institutions are widely recognized, highly valued, and protected, because you don't even have to be directly involved in that particular aspect of an institution to know what it does and why it's important. Now for a brief review of organizations. Unlike social institutions, which was reviewed on the previous slide, organizations represent a smaller unit, hence the word organization, within a social institution. And so all of these organizations are established to pursue particular goals and functions within that institution. So sticking with our example of the institution of education, and thinking more specifically about higher education, we can understand our campus, UH West Oahu, as an organization that is part of the institution of education, right? And so the goal is similar to other organizations, such across the UH system, right, where one of the main goals is to produce research and to produce bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and doctoral degrees, right? And then sometimes there's other degrees like medical and law, right? And this is through taking courses, right? So you need lots of people to make that happen. You need faculty, staff, and students, right? And so One of the ways that we can understand organizations separate from social institutions is that they will each have their own rules and norms. And another way to think about this is policies, right? So West Oahu has its own very specific policies that apply to its students, its faculty, and its staff. They are, of course, going to be very similar compared to the other schools in the system and even schools across the United States, colleges and universities, right? But they are only applicable to its students, faculty, and staff, right? Okay, so to recap our discussion on how institutions and organizations are their own distinct concepts within sociology, but of course related and intertwined. Here is a summary of the major social institutions that sociologists think about and theorize about and study, as well as examples of specific organizations that we can find within various institutions. Okay, so now that we have reviewed what a social institution is and what an organization is and how they're related, we're going to review the characteristics of stratification. So, similar to the way that your textbook has defined this for you, when we're talking about stratification, this is a macro level analysis. So, if you recall from earlier in the semester, when we're talking about macro level, we're looking at things like social institutions, organizations, and groups of people, right? So, we're not just talking about one individual A and individual B. So, that's what we mean when we're talking about stratification. So stratification represents the analysis of systemic inequality between groups of people. So a lot of the times that we think about groups of people within society is we think about economic groups, so economic stratification. We talk about gender, race and ethnicity in terms of education level, and so on and so forth, right? So when we're looking at the way that inequality is present between these groups of people, we're looking at groups based on their demographics. And as you may recall also that this has a lot to do with what their status is, right? So one of the things that stratification emphasizes, in addition to looking at how inequality is systemic, right, which means that it is kind of built into the system, right? It's something that happens over and over. It is being reproduced and it is being reproduced socially, right? So what this means is that it's not random, it's not just kind of happening to one person or a handful of people. And we can think about what's happening right now with these massive closures, and we already have a lot of data on who has lost employment, right? And who's unable to take time off to be at home and to care for children or elderly, right? And that it's not random, right? We can see that this is very much aligned with certain types of occupations, which are aligned with certain types of educational backgrounds, as well as economic class backgrounds. So as it relates to the second point, when we're thinking about how does stratification result from social processes and relationships, that is how we can apply it to the real world and to something that's happening right now. So the last point that I want to make about stratification is that it is, stratification is a way to think about inequality. So basically, stratification and inequality can be used interchangeably, and specifically, stratification is focusing on groups and at the macro level, right? And so, of course, inequality is a bad thing, right? That is the position of sociologists. And it's important to know that stratification, as this relates to the last point, can be intentional or unintentional. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in the next lecture, and this was also highlighted in the other lecture posted about stratification and education, right? That it is not always the case that policies that are implemented or designed intentionally set out to increase or exacerbate stratification. However, it can happen and play out that way. All right, so I have organized here the various types of stratification that are reviewed in your textbook. And what I am emphasizing here is what sociologists and scholars of stratification emphasize as kind of the basis of that inequality. So that's in the first bullet point. So, for example, you see in the estate system, which is reviewed in the chapter, um, we identify this form of inequality as being politically based, right? So the first point that you see under each type of stratification that's listed here is identifying the source of that stratification, kind of what's the basis or the foundation of that inequality. And the second point speaks to the degree to which individuals in this type of system can experience social mobility. So, social mobility, which will be reviewed more depth in the next lecture, is essentially the ability from an individual to move from one kind of rung of the ladder to the next one. And this makes the most sense when we're thinking about it in terms of economics, right? So we have these 5 types of stratification or 5 systems: the estate system, caste system, class system, status hierarchy system, and the power elite. So all of these are reviewed in your textbook. I encourage you to read these sections carefully and to think about the ways that each system, although they all represent stratification and the systematic inequality between groups of people, they have a different foundation or basis of that inequality, and the ability for an individual to experience mobility, specifically class mobility, is going to look different in each of these kinds of systems.